Year after year, month after month, and in some cases, week after week and day after day, people ask me what if questions about the memory palace technique. For example, what if I need to make changes to my memory palace? Well, the need to change can be something that you might want to do. It can involve either correcting part of the memory palace that you find makes using it inefficient, or it can mean expanding a memory palace or maybe connecting it to other memory palaces. And certainly you can do all of these things if absolutely necessary. But I want to share in this video some suggestions that will help you make the process of changing a memory palace smoother. But there are also ways to avoid ever having to renovate a memory palace once you've set it up. And I'll give you an example of where I've resisted renovating the memory palace and just gone with a little bit of a mistake and worked out another way to make the memory palace a going option without having to change it. Because things do change, and memory palaces in the way that I teach it and experience it, they're always changing. I mean, change is the constant in the memory palace. And one opening metaphor that you may find useful is that a lot of people think of their memory as a movie and moving through the memory palace as a kind of movie. And that's cool, but I don't think it's actually realistic to how memory works. I think of it more as a theater stage, and you as the user of the memory palace are a stage director or a theater director, and all of your images in the memory palace are like actors. And you're literally just asking them to recite their lines, and their lines help you remember the target information, ideally in a way that you're using the memory palace to review the information so it gets into long-term memory. And that's a big tip right there. When you design your memory palaces just for the purpose of getting the information into long-term memory, not as some eternal storehouse of the treasure that you're going to come and revisit, like Sherlock Holmes, I must go to my mind palace. That's not really the reality of or even the glory of this technique. The glory and the reality of it is just using it as quickly as possible to get that information into long-term memory so you don't really need the memory palace anymore. But if you want to change your memory palaces and you want to transform it, let's get into the nitty-gritty because there's some angles here. Now, the first thing that I would suggest that you do if you feel the need to change a memory palace is to pause. And that's right, pause. Before you do anything, stop and ask a simple question. Is this really necessary? Why do I think the memory palace needs to be changed? Could I start a new memory palace as an alternative rather than trying to change something that I could use for something else? So if you have a memory palace and it sort of resists whatever it is that you're doing, or it feels clunky for a particular project, like let's say you're memorizing some scripture verbatim and it's just not working in that memory palace, rather than change the memory palace, why not have other memory palaces? I've talked to other places, and you can watch videos on how to find more memory palaces. There's no reason, and I think I've proven it to the nth degree, that you can't have many, many memory palaces, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds. So yes, you can start new memory palaces without changing the ones that you already have, and it is a very, very good strategy. Now, another way to change a memory palace is to compound within the memory palace. So this is about not changing the memory palace, but changing how you're using it. So for example, when you're using the memory palace for language learning, I usually focus on memorizing vocabulary first, usually one word per station. And then using the principle of compounding, I change that word to an entire phrase. And this technique moves from strength to strength because the only thing that it changes is the mnemonic imagery, not any of the memory palaces themselves. So, for example, if you memorize a word like shanti or something like that for body in Mandarin, and then you go jinchang aoye dui shanti buhao, that's the phrase that you add to that, right? And you just do that many, many words over and over and over again. You first establish one word in the memory palace, then you transform that original image and its word to an entire sentence. And you can scale any memory palace from, say, if you've got 10 words in one room to 50, 60, 100 words, depending on how many words are in those sentences. So That's a very, very wonderful strategy to do. And I would suggest that you explore that rather than renovating the Memory Palace, because in a way, it is renovating the Memory Palace, and it's a way to get more out of it. Now, another thing that you can do is just look at things a different way. So recently I was speaking with Anastasia Woolmer, and I was explaining this new issue that I had because I was memorizing a deck of cards a different way than I used to for mem deck work, which has to do with doing magic tricks with a memorized deck. And because I used to memorize on a station-by-station basis, 1 card per station, and now I started doing it 2 cards per station, it was throwing my way of using the number system to remember each card, because now I've got basically 2 numbers on each station. And it was crazy. But nonetheless, speaking with her, I was able to just change my strategy. And by changing the strategy, I was able to solve it. And you can listen to more insight about that on a previous episode of the podcast by watching my discussion about all this with Anastasia Woolmer. And I highly recommend that you do. Now, another strategy is just to not renovate Memory Palaces, but learn to reuse them. And this is a whole topic unto itself. And I've talked about it many times in different ways. So if you want to get into reusing Memory Palaces, the thing that you've got to watch out for is what's called ghosting, or what's sometimes called the ugly sister effect. And very briefly, usually reusing a Memory Palace has to do with adding a feature. So if you imagine this room that I'm in now, and we're using this as a Memory Palace, we would have a feature added to reuse it. So to make it different than this present version, we would add a color like it would be the black version. And then the next version would be the blue version. Then we'd have an orange version, a yellow version, and so on. Now, I have alphabetized those different colors because having your different versions in alphabetical order can help you remember the order of your versions of the same Memory Palace. So this is a way of renovating a Memory Palace, so to speak, because you're painting the walls different colors. But it can create the ghosting and the ugly sister effect that you generally want to avoid. So there are other ways to reuse Memory Palaces that are a little bit more efficient and effective. And you might hear them and say, well, that's not really reusing a Memory Palace in the same way, but I would say that it is. Now, they're intermediate advanced, so they're in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. But if you're really interested in it, I used that approach that I'm referring to reuse the same Memory Palace 3 times. One of the things in that reused Memory Palace is my TEDx Talk. Quite frankly, if I was going to do another TEDx Talk, I wouldn't do a reused Memory Palace approach. But nonetheless, I'm glad I gave the experiment a try, and I'm glad I did it in such a high-risk situation because it taught me a lot about the validity of doing things that way. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about renovating Memory Palaces. We've so far talked about exhausting all other options first. But if you're going to renovate a Memory Palace, what you might want to explore is simply cleaning out the Memory Palace before you even get started. So let's say that you've made a Memory Palace with 25 stations, you find it's too many stations, or you're crossing your own path and it's just a mess. You can't really use it properly. So rather than just going in cold and changing it, you can imagine maybe you have a mop and you go through the Memory Palace and you really just clean it out so that it has that certain freshness. Now, according to 3-time world memory champion Alex Mullen, you can do that kind of stuff. We've talked about that, he and I. But the key is not necessarily to clean the Memory Palace. His suggestion would be going and just leaving the Memory Palace fallow for a certain amount of time. Like a farmer will leave a field fallow and not grow anything in it, or just allow whatever grows there for a couple of seasons so that the soil is replenished. Not using the Memory Palace will tend to fade out anything or most things that are in it. And then when you want to rebuild it, reinstitute your journey inside of it, well, you really won't have any interference. So you're sort of renovating it by leaving it alone. And you will reduce ghosting, although there may still be some ghosting there. But I would generally just agree with Mullen, and I've done this. I've left Memory Palaces empty for a long time, and they just don't have issues. Even though I have had a little bit of, I wouldn't even call it ghosting, like fossilization, but it really wasn't a problem. And here's another thing that you can think about when you do have ghosting and fossilization, or you come across these remnants. how could you just use them? How could you compound onto them? And, they're not always necessarily ugly sisters that cause issues. They could be actually useful tools if you just shift and change and ask them for help. I don't necessarily have a case study here, but it's just something to think about. It's Freud 101. If you push away the monster may only get bigger. But if you say, hey, come in for cookies and milk and have a little conversation with it, you may be able to shift it around. If memory serves, Idris Zogai and I, another memory competitor, we talked about this on a previous episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, so you might want to check out that episode to see what we talked about there, because I think we went through the matter of clearing out memory palaces as well in that discussion. Here's another renovation tip, and this can be an interesting way to expand any memory palace. Add virtual elements to the memory palace. So say you're using a room like this, and you're using it with verisimilitude. You are using it as you remember it, with exactly these shelves. Well, by adding a virtual element, I can renovate it by adding some imaginary bookshelves, like another shelf in front of this shelf. So if I use all the shelves on this bookcase, and then I add another one, then I have expanded the memory palace by changing it with an imaginary element. Now, the problem is that then I have to memorize how that I changed it. So to reduce that memorization, something like having an imaginary bookshelf in front of a real bookshelf doesn't really mean that you have to memorize anything. It's just a conceptual thing that is based on a rule that you've chosen. And so if this bookcase has 5 shelves, then the one in front of it has 5 shelves, so that it's not some new detail that has to be memorized. Not like memorizing, okay, this has 5, now this has 10, and you have to memorize the number 10. So I think this is going to be useful if you want to experiment with it. But at the end of the day, I think you just have a lot better progress by starting a new memory palace. I've always found that to be faster, more direct, and ultimately more effective because it doesn't create new things to remember, right? It's just using, because a proper memory palace is based on what's already in your memory palace. It's not memorized at all. It's just using what's already in your mind. And when you get into intermediate and advanced levels, here's a way to really, really go deep on this. Every single image can be a memory palace. In fact, if you build out your 00 to 99 PAO and you have at least one of the 4 different peg word methods, you're going to have all kinds of images that can be turned into memory palaces. So here's a bit of a case study around this. I was working with a private coaching client the other day, and she was asking me for help with memorizing a certain aspect of the law. So there was a term like Supreme Court jurisdiction, and how was she going to remember the sub-points all about this? And I just thought, okay, so Supreme Court basically has the word Superman in it, right? And so now all those sub-points, Superman is your character for S, and it even has the SUP in it. And to a certain extent, you also have the R from Supreme for Supreme Court in Superman. It's not exactly spelled that way, but nonetheless, these are little hooks. And so you can have Superman and then have his body as a memory palace. So the image that you would use for Supreme becomes itself a body memory palace using Superman as a statue. Superman statue can be in a standard memory palace or just used in a more abstract way. Now, what would that memory palace be? Well, by linking S to S, you can also think, well, okay, so S to S, I have a friend named Stacy, right? And that is going to be where the Superman statue goes. And Stacy's body can also be used as a memory palace. But you can go a little bit further because S has a certain shape. S has a top, it has a middle, and a bottom. The letter S itself can be used as a mini memory palace. So what you have is the standard body of Superman or Stacy, and put the Superman shield on Stacy. That shield itself, the S, has a top, middle, and a bottom. And now you have more stations, more modifications inside of the memory palace to expand it from within. There are a lot more ways that you can expand memory palaces along these lines. The point is you do not have to renovate them. You do not have to change memory palaces. Although if you want to, clean them out first or leave them fallow. There are so many things to explore, and there's a beautiful abundance that you will find just from your practice. So I would encourage you to have multiple memory palaces for each letter of the alphabet. Start to work in a combinatory way where every memory palace has a name of a person attached to it. Like Stacy is a figure that you use in your Stacy memory palace. Adam is a figure that you use in your Adam memory palace. Zoltan is a figure you have in your Zed memory palace. And if you don't know these people, look somebody up. Start to learn the names of people. Frank Zappa, you may already know him. If you don't, listen to some of his music. It's very memorable. And then you can follow him around a memory palace that either the memory palace starts with the letter Z, or you can use some of the more advanced techniques in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass, where I teach you how to turn numbers into consonants and then how to attach those consonants to buildings in the world so that you could have a Zappa memory palace, a General Zod memory palace, a Zoltan memory palace, and so on and so on. You could have more success than you ever dreamed possible, but you need to actually develop the systems for yourself so that you're able to use them. Have 1 word, 5 words, 15 words, 50 words, and all of these are possible memory palaces unto themselves. But you got to be in the game. And ultimately, my experience over the decade plus that I've been teaching these techniques is that your experience is the key. It is the clavis magna, the great key, as Giordano Bruno called it. And one of the only mysteries that remains is, why do some people hesitate and not just jump in? Well, I hope that this has helped you start to formulate a way to take action, or if you're already taking action, giving you ideas about new ways that you can get started. If you found this useful, make sure to hit that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're not already subscribed, and go to magneticmemorymethod.com where you can take my free course or just jump into the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. And there will be no what ifs about it, because when you know how to experiment with these techniques, you'll know how to dig deeper and deeper and deeper just by what we've covered today. Changing how you think about it. Making little alterations just in how you're using images inside of your memory palaces. You have powerful alternatives now. So you can renovate memory palaces if you want to, but you don't have to. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching. Come visit me at magneticmemorymethod.com, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.